Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium. I'm a day late. It's Friday, September 19th, 2014. I had a very bad sinus yesterday, so I apologize for being late with this, but I had to get this talked about because it's playing to some of the ideas, hypotheses I've been putting out there about long-term developments in geopolitics and the world power structure. This is an article that is actually from the BRICS website itself. And I'm going to read portions of this article because it's got some very significant news. The article itself is titled China Announces Clearing Bank in Paris for Renminbi Business. That's the trade in the Chinese currency, the renminbi, or sometimes it's called the yuan. Now listen very closely to this. It starts out by stating this, quote, "The People's Bank of China, the country's central bank, announced on Monday that it had authorized the Bank of China as a clearing bank for renminbi business in Paris. The PBOC, the People's Bank of China, made the decision in accordance with a memorandum of understanding signed with the French central bank, La Banque de France, to help turn the city into an offshore renminbi center. The Bank of China became the renminbi clearing bank in Frankfurt, and I blogged about that a few weeks ago, you'll recall, in June, while China Construction Bank was authorized to be the renminbi clearing bank in London. China stepped up plans to increase the international use of its currency last October with an agreement between the European Central Bank and the People's Bank of China to swap euros and yuan. In other words, we're seeing the same pattern of bilateral currency swaps to avoid the dollar. All right. Now, at the very end of this article, there are two more very, very important statements. Listen carefully. Quote, "Meanwhile, the UK will become the first Western country to issue an offshore bond in the Chinese renminbi. This was announced after discussions between the Chinese Vice Premier Ma Kai and the United Kingdom Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne earlier last week. Osborne says the issue will be similar in size to a $2 billion renminbi bond issued in London by the China Development Bank." Unquote. So now look what we have. We've been watching China negotiate these bilateral currency trading agreements with India, Iran, Russia, most recently in the last couple of weeks, Argentina. We've watched them set up a renminbi denominated bond market in Frankfurt on the Frankfurt Bourse. Now this is spread to the United Kingdom and to France. All right. Now I've been predicting that the BRICS nations would eventually have to set up, if they're going to be serious about competing with the dollar as a reserve currency and about competing with the Western financial system, that they're going to have to set up several things. They're going to have to set up their own development bank, which they've done. They're going to have to set up their own international electronic financial clearing mechanism. And that's going to require putting into place a network of clearing banks around the world. And we're watching this. This is part of what we're watching happen right now with China setting up these clearing banks now in Paris and with the United Kingdom. All right. Now, I'm going to suggest something here, and I've said this before. There's two consequences of this I think we have to pay attention to over the long term. This is not something that's going to play out in a short amount of time because all of this has huge geopolitical implications, and that's really what I'm driving to. But the first thing they're going to have to do is they're going to have to dramatically expand their space assets. The BRICS nations are going to have to dramatically expand their space assets in order to have a global system of international financial clearing based or denominated in renminbi or whatever other currency they choose. But it's certainly looking like the renminbi is going to be it. So I want to draw your attention to something else that recently happened. China and Russia signed an agreement to share their global positioning satellite networks and the data with each other. And this obviously has military implications, but it's also a presage. It's a harbinger, I think, of things that are going to come in terms of space cooperation among the BRICS nations, because space is going to be the key component for that international financial clearing. But I want to talk about the geopolitical aspect of this. This is the second component, I think, that we have to pay a very, very close attention to, because this type of network of international financial clearing ultimately is going to involve a geopolitical commitment to protect the trade with China and Western Europe. So in other words, I'm also suggesting that China's moves, particularly with respect to Europe and particularly with respect to the big three European powers. Look what's happened now in the last year. We've got Germany on board, and I fully expect that Germany is going to lead a charge or be involved with, in some very influential way, to have these bilateral currency agreements, euros for renminbi, bypassing the dollar altogether. All right. Now we've got France linked into this network, and now we've got the United Kingdom linked into this network. That's the three big European powers. Italy and Spain will follow shortly. All right. That is in my opinion, folks, that's a camel's nose in the door that's going to have a long-term geopolitical military implication. Because what it's going to do is it's going to gradually pry, in my opinion, over the very long term, it's going to gradually pry European commitment to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to NATO, away from that organization. In other words, this is also, in my opinion, a very clever agenda on the part of China and the other BRICS nations. Russia's been cooperating in this, obviously. This is a long-term agenda to pry Europe away from the United States. And it stands to reason that they would attempt to do so because, as I've pointed out, much of Germany's export-driven economy is in terms of trade with Asia. It's in terms of trade with China. It's in terms of trade with Russia, and so on and so forth. And because Germany is a major trading partner with the United States, this eventually means that trade may be conducted in renminbi unless they want to try and straddle the fence and make those bilateral currency agreements with the United States to trade directly in dollars and euro. So this could be a long-term agenda that we're watching getting started as something that may, and I want to underline, stress, boldface, and italicize, that may, over the very long term, see a final dissolution of NATO, or at least a dramatic revision in its charter so that it would look nothing like the organization that it is today. Now that's going to have its own geopolitical consequences because, as we've seen, the United States is attempting to keep NATO together by shifting bases into Eastern Europe and continue the game of the encirclement of Russia. And now we've seen evidence and claims that Russia has indeed put boots on the ground in the western Ukraine. That doesn't surprise me. I still maintain that what you're seeing isn't a full-fledged Russian invasion. It's rather evidence of something I've been warning about that's going to happen. If you keep playing the covert operations game, this nation building, put quotation marks around that, this nation building game, then that's a game that two people can play. And the BRICS nations are going to start playing it and pushing back. And it's not going to be restricted to Russia. It will include China. And it's a game that could come, pardon me, it could come to North America. So in other words, if we can play around in their backyard, they can play around in our backyard. So this is a game that's now afoot, very, very definitely. And you're seeing China going after the big three in Western Europe. the nations that have the most in terms of economic and military power, particularly in France's case. So watch this game very carefully, folks. I think it's going to intensify over the next few years, probably over the next 3 years. But in the long term, I think the ultimate goal here is to use the financial arrangements as a lever, as a mechanism by which to begin to pry the military alliance apart. And that is a game that I think you're going to see Russia fully on board with. You're going to see some announcement. I'm almost willing to bet you money. You're going to see some announcement in the next year or two of those nations, the BRICS bloc, in particular Russia and China, challenging the whole basis of the NATO alliance. And watch Japan now very carefully, because as this is going on, I just recently blogged about that article that appeared in Chinese about the possibility that the huge military exercises that China conducted last summer may have been an attempt to either forestall a coup or cement a coup. We don't really know, but there's something going on internally and domestically in China. And I think you're going to see in that article, you saw that China had secretly invited a former Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Fukuda, who's a member of the Liberal Democratic Party, the ruling party in Japan right now, has been for quite some time, to China for talks about how to mend the fence. So watch Japan as all of this is going on very carefully, because we're going to see China expanding that circle of bilateral agreements and currency swaps in the Pacific Rim rather dramatically. I fully expect this is going to happen. It's already happening with Australia. It's already happening with South Korea. And we're going to see that expand rather dramatically elsewhere in the Pacific Rim. So that's it for my news and views from the Nefarium for Friday, a day late, September 19th, 2014. God bless everybody, and I'll see you on the flip side.